Hi everyone. This is going to be a review for the Unit 3 exam. I was unable to access our Class Connect session today, so I'm hoping this is the next best thing. The Unit 3 exam is due today. However, it is an exam, so there won't be late deductions taken off of that. And just also keep in mind that the discussions are closing tonight at 11:59 p.m. And as always, you're required to make 2 posts. You can email me your response to the discussion topics after it has closed, but at that point you will receive reduced credit. And for Unit 4, just something to keep in mind is that we're not doing the first writing assignment, nor are we doing the second discussion. We're going to get started with classical conditioning, and you remember this was Ivan Pavlov, and he did the experiments with the dogs and salivation. Basically what was happening is he was able to make the dogs associate a bell ringing with meat powder, and that's when they would start salivating. And you're going to have to know what a UCS is, and that is the unconditioned stimulus. And in this case, that was the meat powder because the dogs reacted naturally to the meat powder. It was unconditioned. The UCR is the unconditioned response. So in the very beginning, when they saw meat powder, they were reacting to that by salivating, and that was not taught. They did that naturally. So what Pavlov did was he's going to pair a neutral stimulus with the unconditioned response. So what was happening was he was associating the two things. The neutral stimulus is the bell. He was pairing that with the meat powder to see if he could get the salivation happening within the dogs. So after the dogs started connecting the bell with the food, the bell did become the conditioned stimulus. The dogs were conditioned, so they were taught to salivate at the sound of the bell. And then also what became the conditioned response? In this case, it's still salivation, but it was after it was taught, so it's still the conditioned response. So if you have any questions about that, please let me know. For the UCS and the UCR, remember, behavior happens naturally. It is unconditioned. This is not learned. It is not taught to them. Unconditioned means it happens naturally. It's instinctual. We were going to play a little quick game of Jeopardy where we had little categories, and our word bank was extinction, acquisition, discrimination, generalization, and spontaneous recovery. You will need to know what all of those means. So acquisition is the number of trials that it would take for an association to be made. Generalization, this is responding to similar stimuli. It's like a dog salivating at the sound of a handheld bell and a doorbell. Even though they're different sounds, they're similar enough that the dog will respond to them. It's general enough. So that's where you get generalization. Discrimination, this is when you are the test subject, does not respond to similar stimuli. In the case of the doorbell and the handbell, maybe they are just different enough where the dog's not going to respond to the doorbell the same way he did to the handbell. So he's discriminating between the two sounds. Extinction. This is when an unconditioned stimulus is not followed by a conditioned stimulus. Essentially what happens is the subject stops making the association, so it becomes extinct. And then finally, spontaneous recovery. This would be after something has become extinct. This is the revival of extinguished responses. The behavior occurs once again, and it kind of occurs out of the blue, where the dog maybe stops salivating at the sound of a doorbell for a really long time, and then all of a sudden he hears the doorbell one day, he starts salivating. That would be spontaneous recovery. Moving on with classical conditioning still. Remember, you have Watson and baby Albert. You did a discussion about that. Mary Covert Jones, she developed the counter conditioning. She worked with a child named Peter who was afraid of rabbits. And what she was wondering if she could do was get Peter to get over this fear of rabbits by pairing something he was afraid of with something he really liked. So she started pairing rabbits with candy. And essentially what this was doing was associating something pleasant with something scary. And by doing this, she was able to get him over his fear of candy, which was fantastic, and really started the process of counter conditioning. There's also a term called flooding, and for flooding, what we're talking about is that, let's say you're afraid of snakes. Well, flooding, that principle is going to rest on, if you're afraid of snakes, let's put you in a room with hundreds of snakes. And by having so much of this sensory input into it, you're going to get over it sooner rather than later. Systematic desensitization would be, let's go back to the snakes. You're sitting in a room, and let's put you in a room with one snake. Okay, let's let you get used to that. And let's put 2 snakes, 3 snakes. And slowly but surely you should be starting to get more used to those snakes. And that would be systematic desensitization. Operant conditioning was B.F. Skinner. And he really said that the theory of learning states that the consequences of behavior operate or produce effects on the environment. Essentially, what they're saying is, can you get the behavior to happen again or not? How do you do that? And what Skinner did was he worked with animals where he developed a special training box where the animals would perform tasks and they would either get rewarded or punished. Basically, did they get food or not? And that would really tell if they were going to do that same specific task again, or how they were going to go about doing it. So remember, that's all about reinforcement and punishment. Moving on, positive reinforcers. You got to know the difference between these two, and they seem like a bit of an oxymoron at first, that you can have a positive reinforcer and a negative reinforcer. But a positive reinforcer, an example is, telling someone they did a good job, giving them a compliment on a new haircut. Those are going to ensure that they continue on with that behavior. A negative reinforcer is taking something bad away. If we remember in the Class Connect session, I used the example of your parents nag you to clean your bedroom. Well, you finally clean it and there's no more nagging. So hopefully you're going to continue keeping it clean so you don't have to experience that nagging again. In punishment, this is an unwanted response following a behavior. It could be anything from maybe a child being put in time out to getting car keys taken away. Reinforcement schedules, make sure you understand those. This all goes with operant conditioning. So you have fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. You will need to know those. Moving on to memory, we have the information processing model. You will need to know this for the short essay portion of the exam. And remember, this occurs in 3 systems. So you have the sensory memory, the short-term memory, and the long-term memory. So it starts off as all the sensations from our environment enter the sensory memory. They then go into the short-term memory, which holds 5 to 9 pieces of information. And depending on what you do with that information, like you can chunk the information, you can do rehearsal. Depending upon that, it may or it may not move into the long-term memory. Your sensory memory, kind of going back that a little bit, you have iconic memory, that's your visual memory, echoic memory, and we talked about the short-term memory, and the long-term memory. There's 2 ways to get information to your long-term memory. One is very highly effective, one is not so effective. Shallow processing, that is just when you're trying to memorize the information, not very effective whatsoever. And deep processing, this is where you're trying to connect the information with things you already know. You're trying to make the information meaningful. Mnemonic devices are great things to help store memory, put information into your long-term memory. So it'd be like Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Oh, forgetting. There's a lot of information for forgetting. Forgetting is simply you're unable to get the information out of long-term storage. That might be due to lack of cues, interference. Really put a star next to interference, proactive, especially proactive interference. You can use this on one of the short essay examples. Tip of the tongue, childhood amnesia, repression. We talked about all of those in our last CC. So if you need a little refresher on that, go back and listen to that one. Hippocampus, you'll need to know that. That's the part of the brain that appears to be involved in the processing of short-term memories into long-term memories. And then you also need to be aware of the serial position effect. So we're not going to do this, but there are a whole bunch of words on the next slide. And I was going to give you time to memorize it. But what usually happens is that people remember the first couple things on the list and the last couple things on the list. And when they remember the first ones, that's called the primacy effect. When you remember the last part of the list, that's the recency effect. But what the serial position effect says is that people will more than likely forget the items in the middle of the list. Moving on, well, still with vocabulary, I guess, we have three types of long-term memories. We have the episodic memory, the semantic memory, and the procedural memory. And for short answers, these are they're each worth 10 points. You only have to pick one. The first one is, option 1 is, how does information get encoded? So for that, you're going to want to know the memory model, and you're going to want to identify correct terms in each part. So I briefly went over that. I would also talk about chunking with that one. For option 2, what type of memory problems can occur? This one, you want to talk about interference, sensory overload, and how do you overcome those problems. So that's what you're going to have to address for the essay portion of the exam. So basically, make sure you understand the difference between classical and operant conditioning. Make sure you understand how information gets processed and put into our memory, and then know your terminology. That's a very important part about it. Please let me know if you have any questions or concerns prior to taking the exam. I know this was a fairly short video and I apologize for it, but I'm always available for questions. So good luck on the exam. As always, I will go in and put points for the short essay, so don't get nervous when you see it pop up or you maybe only got 40 out of 50 or what have you. So once again, good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.